One of the things that Christianity gets accused of is not being for the value of women, which is partially because we don't always read the biblical texts in their proper context. In fact, Christianity is very pro-women because it's very pro-people, pro-creation of a creator. And oftentimes we look at the Old Testament, we see certain passages in there that make us say, oh man, how can this be for women? But we oftentimes don't realize that God is making regulations around a culture that is drastically different from the one we live in now. Or we look at the New Testament and we see certain verses and things that in women, and we interpret them through the lens of, hey, you know what, women are devalued or women aren't as important. But actually, those texts are just actually speaking about something that may be particular to that context or to that culture, and maybe we're understanding them differently. Let me just give an example of the way that Christianity values women. And my favorite story of this is the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. And this particular passage in John chapter 7, and also going into John chapter 8, is one of those very interesting passages, because essentially what happens is the Pharisees, or the religious leaders who were very excited about how morally good they were and always took every opportunity they could to tell people about how morally good they were, brought this woman to Jesus, and she had been caught in the act of adultery. Now, here's what's interesting about that, is they only bring the woman to Jesus. They don't bring the man who was also involved in the act with her. Once again, you see a reflection of the culture and how the culture looked at the woman and saw her as the problem and saw her as one who was worth publicly shaming as opposed to the man. But once again, we see the culture decided to isolate the woman and say, look at her, and offered her to Jesus saying, look what she's done. She was in this horrible act, and the laws say that she should be killed for this. But you, what are you gonna do? And they think they have him in a trap. Because if Jesus says, okay, the law says she should be killed, let's go ahead and kill her, he would be arrested. Now, side note, the laws that they're referring to are in the Old Testament, and they actually don't say she should be killed. They actually say both she and the man should be. But the Pharisees left that part out quite conveniently. Regardless, the idea is that they knew that if Jesus actually carried out this particular thing and had her killed for her immoral behavior, that the Roman guards that were walking around would arrest him, because the Jews could not carry out these kind of behaviors. They couldn't kill each other. But if Jesus said, don't worry about it, you know what? She just made a mistake. We really don't need to punish her. Then essentially he would be saying, I'm not following the law. So they felt like they had him in a trap. No matter what Jesus did, he was going to be in trouble. And so they just wanted to see what he was going to do. And Jesus writes something in the ground, something that we don't know what he said, but I wish I could find the answer to, and I will ask him one day, what did you write in the ground? And then he looks at them. These religious leaders, these men who brought this woman out, brought her sin out into the public, humiliated her, shamed her. I don't know what she looked like. I don't know what clothes she was wearing, but she was clearly embarrassed. She would have had to have been. And they brought her out. And Jesus looks at them and says, any one of you who's never done anything wrong, go ahead and begin punishing her. And what's interesting is these religious leaders learned they can't. There's nothing that they can do, because they have done something wrong, and they couldn't say that they haven't done something wrong, because then they would be lying and doing something wrong by lying. So they couldn't say they'd never done anything wrong, and so they just began to walk away. And Jesus looks at this woman, and he says to her, you know, people were just here to kill you. Where have they gone? And she looks around and they said, they've all left. And she says, I don't condemn you either, but go and don't do this again. And here's what's interesting to me about this story. What's interesting to me is that when the religious people came and brought her before Jesus, they were angry with her. She was caught in an immoral action. She was doing something bad, and they were angry with her for the decisions that she had made. But after they'd encountered Jesus, and after they watched him stand up for her, he didn't kill her. He didn't say hateful things to her. He didn't embarrass her even more. He didn't humiliate her. He, in a sense, protected her. A sinner. He protected her. What about these righteous, really, really good Pharisee people? He didn't protect the really, really good. He protected the sinner. And those Pharisees walked away that day being upset with him. They brought her to Jesus and were angry with her for what she's done. By the time they finished with Jesus, they were angry with him because he had humiliated them. And they'd remember that. They'd remember how Jesus responded to her. And they would keep that in their minds for the future. And what you see here in the story is the great way in which God is contrasting Jesus' entrance into the world with the culture. The culture says she's a woman, she's important, she's devalued, let's punish her. Jesus says, I'm protecting her. I don't agree with what she did, but I'm willing to offer her forgiveness as I encourage her to not sin anymore. You see the change, and you see how God was willing in that moment to stand up for this woman. It's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story that changes so much. When Jesus rose from the dead, the very first people to see him rise from the dead were women, which is crazy because once again, women didn't have that level of respect and authority in this culture. And they are the ones who are about to tell the world that Jesus is alive? Why did God have them there if he didn't see women as important? But he gave the truth to them, and they in turn gave it to other people to say, we have seen him alive. You see these stories throughout Jesus' life, where he's slowly, bit by bit, changing the way the culture views women and helping them to see and understand women in a whole new way. Christianity is very much for women. It is a place where you can come and use your gifts and use your strengths and find a home within the Christian message. And I love that, and I'm thankful that I serve a God who looks at a woman in her darkest and most humiliating moment of that day, at least, and says, I'm here, and I'll protect you, and I'll comfort you, and I will help you through this. To me, that's a gospel message that is for women.